everyone. Thank you all for coming out. This is the second in a series of presentations on our natural world. A week ago or so, we heard about the state of the coral reefs with Jeff Miller and Caroline Rogers. And this evening, or this afternoon, we're very fortunate, very lucky to have probably the most knowledgeable person in the world about the flora and fauna of St. John here, who spent her life here and has studied this for, well, ever since she was a young kid. So, Eleanor Gibney, who everybody here pretty much knows. Eleanor suspected there were two people who didn't know her, but they'll keep that a secret. Anyway, without any further ado or any more nonsense from me, we'll get started. So, Eleanor?
Good evening, everyone. I'm really amazed at the turnout for this event. I was telling everyone that, no, coral reef is just so much more exciting for people, that the fact there were a lot of people here last week doesn't mean that they're going to be very many tonight, but I'm really happy that people are interested. Obviously, it's a huge subject to tackle. Basically, the effects of the Hurricane Irma, mainly, on everything above sea level on the island. And I've tried to put together a presentation that focuses on the questions and issues that people have been asking me about, rather than just about any random thing that might be interesting to me. So I hope this works out. We will have some time at the end for questions. And I divided things, I hope, somewhat by subject. We'll see how this works. As I said, we got a lot of pictures to go through, a lot of observations. I am not a paid employee of the Park Service or of anyone else, so it's been really difficult for me personally, in many cases, to be motivated to go out and look at things, because it's still hitting me on a really, really gut level. Change is inevitable, but change generally happens fairly slowly, and to have your entire known world really totally altered in the space of about 3 hours, which is what it amounted to. For the North Shore and the areas that were hit the hardest, it was a very fast event. If it had been longer, we might not have anything left. We might not have a building to be inside of here, the intensity of what happened. Second here, I'm going to see if I can, nope. Always be the image that stays in my mind of the days right after Irma, the national park sign at the top of Lynn Point, whenever we try to break through on the one lane of the road coming from Hawks Nest into Cruz Bay, that the sign was broken, and the Virgin Islands nation really felt like we were on our own. Hoping this will do that. So, hurricanes happen. They are part of our natural system here. They, on average, over time, probably about every 20 years through recorded history, on the average, there have been serious hurricanes affecting these islands. Our native vegetation is very well adapted to deal with them, but over the last 300 years or so, a lot has been altered on this island that makes it a little more difficult for the vegetation to cope. It's interesting that a very important anniversary actually happened 3 weeks ago, and I didn't see any mention of it anywhere, which is somewhat a sign of the times. But 300 years ago, March 25th, was the day that the Danish officially occupied St. John and came in. They've been people, Europeans, here for the previous at least 100 years or more, but they were in small groups, and they were constantly being harassed by the British from Tortola. But in 1718, they came in and started trying to turn St. John into a productive agricultural island, which was very, very difficult, because not only were those hurricanes happening regularly, there were severe droughts also on the average of about every 20 years. So, but that, in many ways, is what has made St. John what it is now, an island with a lot of beautiful forest. It's not this forest on St. John didn't happen because Lawrence Rockefeller said, oh, let's make a national park here 60 whatever years ago. He made the national park here because there was forest. And it was the forest that made the island, as much as the beaches and the sea around us, it's what made the island attractive. And if anybody's ever doubted how important foliage is to this island, if you were here on September 7th, you're not, no. This photograph is the only picture of Cruz Bay that I've ever been able to find right after the 1916 hurricane. And 101 years before Irma, it was the most damaging hurricane of the 20th century. And that's Cruz Bay Dock. And if you look to slightly to the right on the skyline there, you'll see a coconut palm that's very obviously making it plain that a hurricane has passed within the previous 6 months or so. 1916 was really just about a year before transfer, and St. John was hurting very much. They were begging for assistance that really never came in that case. There were only about 1,000 people on the island, but a lot of people lost everything in that storm. And then there was another hurricane in 1924, and one in 1928, and one in 1932. And then nothing until Hugo in 1989. Well, David wasn't anything. No, it was not. No, even then it wasn't anything really. It was a breeze. It was a high wind and some branches down. There was some defoliation here and there, but there was only. So we went for all those years without anything happening, and our forests did really, really well. This is the valley behind Gift Hill School. There in the area of Beaverhouseburg. Last year in the spring, and it had been a long time since anything really damaged those areas severely. Both Hugo and Marilyn were hurricanes that came out of the south, and one of the big differences with Irma, besides its strength, of course, was the fact that it came from the east and north. And the strong winds from Irma were totally the opposite of our prevailing winds, which come out of the east, and every serious hurricane that had struck us since at least one of the 1920s hurricanes may have come out of the north, but we don't really know. Nobody said anything about it. But this is a forest that was in some ways ripe for the plucking. There is a theory that they call the intermittent disturbance hypothesis, which is a fancy way of saying that forests actually need disturbance. And whether it's from hurricanes or from forest fires, which we thankfully don't get here, or other factors that clear the way and allow for regeneration. Maximum diversity happens when there is intermittent disturbance. So there it was, that was the Sunday. I actually just came across this on my desktop of my big computer when I was going through things. What Irma did was actually something I've never seen a hurricane do. It was already at our latitude, way out there, and it made that dip. But they were predicting still on Sunday that it would pass well to the east of us. And it really wasn't until Tuesday, the day before, that it became very obvious that it wasn't going to do that. It was still coming down and not curving up in time. So, here, I have not made slides with writing on them, but in a few cases I have done before and after. This is where I have lived my entire life. Google Earth is not quite a match-up. The Google Earth picture on the left is from early in 2017, and it's a little bit elongated. But in the space of those 3 hours, a huge amount was lost. A lot of my observations have to do with my own personal area, because that's really what I'm still dealing with 7 months later. But basically what happened there on the North Shore, on the sandy shores that face the west, which is where that wind and the waves came from, was that all of the front line of vegetation was lost and the sea went all the way in. My house is the one on the shore on the far right there. We had a very large sea debris line 120 feet through where the previous vegetation line had been. All of the vegetation that had been on the shore was piled up 120 feet inland, along with a lot of other stuff.
Were you home?
I was thankfully at a good friend's house here in Cruz Bay. My brother was staying. The view up from my driveway up to North Shore Road to about 3 days later, that's a part of my gate line there. And the view up the hill to houses above us, that some of which were totally invisible before. And before and after of the view from my front porch. Yeah. So yes, coconut
But
trees.
the fountain is still there.
The fountain is still there. It had coconut trees lying in it, as you can kind of see on the left of that one. It had salt water in my fountain, which my father built in 1961, and the amount of salt water that went in there almost finished everything off, but it all actually came back. But coconut trees were particularly hard hit by Irma. And there's been a lot of discussion and controversy and back and forth. Should coconut trees be replanted in the national park on the beaches? Because everybody's going, yes, you know, and I would agree that some coconut trees would be fine. However, they obviously do not do well in major hurricanes. We'll see a lot more examples of that. And on the front line, what I saw was that their root balls, being very compact, were very easily eroded and the entire tree came out. Whereas other trees, like tropical almond trees, even a few sea grapes, had roots that went way inland, and they were very hard to dislodge, and some of them are in fact still alive in spite of lying on their sides. So I'll talk just a little bit more about the history of coconut trees. This photograph actually shows where my house is in 1910. My father didn't build the house until 1940, but in 1910, the owner of the property, who was a man named John Lindquist, who was a mixed-race man. His father was Danish and his mother was a St. Jonian. Lindquist owned a lot of real estate on St. John, and he raised cattle, and where the areas were appropriate, he planted fruit crops. So everything on that side in the foreground on the right is bananas, and behind it there's a line of coconut trees, and then there are coconut trees along the beach. So this photo was taken in 1910. The coconut trees appear to already be probably close to 10 years old, so presumably he planted them right around 1900. The last of Lindquist's coconut trees went with her. So, there were still a few hanging on. The ones on that front line on the beach, several of them got obviously pushed over by hurricane erosion and winds, and presumably the 1932 hurricane, because this is actually, believe it or not, one of the very first postcards I found I have a really big postcard collection, that actually, from the Virgin Islands at all, that shows coconut palms and white sand in the same picture. This is a 1937 postcard, and the palm lying right across the beach has been gone a long time, but the other one, the taller one, was still there in Irma. So there were two of them, you could see. My parents are in that photo, both of them. It's a very posed picture from Life magazine article in 1947, not long after my parents had arrived on St. John. And they were the most photographed. That is actually someone a lot of you know. That is David Knight Sr. He would kill me, but he's safely in Denmark right now.
That's great.
And that is actually me. So I've been looking at the coconut trees in that particular place for a long time. And the tall coconut in there is the one that shows up in the background of the 1937 postcard. So that's a picture last year. So yeah, it was beautiful. But in the 1970s, we had Lindquist oak coconuts and a few younger ones. But in the 1970s, as tourism started to escalate, my parents were fairly fanatical about privacy, and my mother planted coconuts galore on the front line on the shore. And, as it turns out, she probably should have tried to mix some other things in with them. What did a lot better overall? Let's backtrack a second on coconuts. Coconuts are not, of course, native to the Caribbean, and they did not get here by ocean currents. Or if they did, it was after humans were already moving things around the world. There's evidence, genetic evidence now, that they originated in two different places where they were domesticated, were in India and on the Malay Peninsula. And all of the coconuts in the Caribbean and Africa are the ones from India, and all the ones in the Pacific are the ones from the Malay Peninsula. And those Pacific ones actually did make it all the way to the west coast of South America, probably with the Polynesian explorers and settlers, but they are not genetically similar at all to the ones that are here. And what is native here are a few palms. The tall palm in this picture is what's now called the Puerto Rican royal palm, but it's considered native on both St. Croix and Tortola, where there are large wild populations, and it's quite probable that it was, although restricted to moisture areas. As you can see, it's done a really great job recovering from from being a telephone pole back to flowering and fruiting already in this time. Then the tire palms, which are our common native palm, the skinny fan palms that are making a huge comeback on St. John before the hurricane, and most of them made it through the hurricane. The reason they got apparently rarer than they had been because those leaves were the favorite thatching material for buildings. And up until the 1930s, when galvanized started arriving in large amounts, most actual dwelling houses were thatched here. Those are the tire palms on top of Trunk Key, still hanging in there really well in a really difficult location. I mentioned droughts, just as an aside. This is a photo from 2015 when we actually had the most severe short but severe drought, when it basically didn't rain from March until September. And I actually took a lot of photos of vegetation at that time, which ended up being lucky for comparison. This is exactly the same piece of shoreline underneath Peace Hill. And I don't know if anybody in the back can make that out, but there are two large trees. The one on the left, taken during the drought, the two large trees are water mampoo trees, one of our stalwart native trees, very drought resistant. And between them you see all the columnar cactus, which totally got washed away by Irma. Those were the waves. I know that was the waves and not the wind, because all of that cactus ended up in my yard. And I picked it up as it was rotting afterwards. And another comparison, the end of that point there, where actually whole rocks are missing. If you look at the very tip of the point, you'll see the little piece sticking up there that's not there anymore. And then, yeah, that again was the waves crashing into the west-facing slopes. A cartoon somebody shared on Facebook a few months ago that everywhere that I see really big erosion problems on St. John, where it has caused problems, has been because buildings have been too close to the sea to begin with, and other factors that have come into, like the death of reefs that protected areas. This is a picture taken in the winter in 1994. If you look at the Oppenheimer end of the beach there on the left, you can really scarcely tell there's a building there. You can kind of make out a roof. There was a lot of vegetation. That, taken from sea level, is the contrast between 1980 and December. One of the big factors there, along with the fact that erosion was happening and there wasn't any replanting going on, is that there's a patch reef right offshore there that was, through my childhood, an extremely healthy and high-profile reef. It used to stick out of the water at low tide. All the Elkhorn would be well above the tide level. In 1982 actually, the Virgin Islands government built a new clinic up on Centerline Road. And you think, oh, how could that affect something that happened in Hawks Nest Bay? Actually, that clinic is right at the top of the gut that empties right there by that patch reef. And then when they leveled all that area for the clinic and the helipad up there, they pushed all the fill into the top of the gut. About 9 months later, on April 18th, 1983, so that's 35 years ago this week, we had a 100-year flood. We had 18 inches of rain in 14 hours. So be prepared, it could happen at any time this time of year. So, again, Google Earth's not the easiest, but the building all that development at the bottom of the picture, this is looking north. On the left you have Kenny Chesney houses, in the middle is the clinic, and then there's the lumber yard. But all that went into the gut from the clinic ended up sitting on the floor of the bay. And because that reef was right there, it actually, all the coral there died within the next 3 or 4 years. It's never come back in that sense. So things are extremely connected on our island. Another old photo. I have an enormous collection of old images because that's been my passion for years. So this is Cinnamon Bay and Peter Bay from America Hill in 1911. And you can see the building that became the Cinnamon Bay Museum there at the bottom right, where there were a lot of trees at that time between the building and the sea. And that erosion process started there in the 1960s, but it escalated since we started having more severer hurricanes and near misses by hurricanes passing us in the last 25 or 30 years. And I'm moving up North Shore and away from home, but many of the coconut palms that were most beloved by photographers on St. John were as picturesque as they were because of storm damage and erosion. Those coconuts didn't just decide they were going to lean out like that. Their roots were totally undermined by hurricanes that passed to the north, but not close enough to do wind damage, but with sea damage happening. And again, that area of Maho Beach, where there actually was the pavilion there, which had been built as a private house in the early 1950s, and there was actually, where the bathrooms are, was another house that the park tore down in probably by the late 70s. So the fact that there wasn't vegetation behind the beach on that section was what made it look like this in October. This was actually before they cleared the road. The first time we drove that far, Stephanie Geyer-Stevens standing there, we had to park at that end of Maho because that's as far as you could drive on October 8th, I think. Yeah, they got out there. But then, one of my favorite old images of St. John is this incredibly real picture of Maho Bay in 1903. It's a painting by Reese Carstensen, who is a Danish ship captain, and it could have been, except for the fishermen with their nets hanging to dry, it could have been painted last summer. There is far more difference in Maho Bay between last August and now than there was between 1903 and last August. And they've been coconut trees planted on Maho Bay for a long time, because that's 1903. This is 1849, from the backside of Ajax Peak, with one of those royal palms that I mentioned earlier. America Hill is the house with the red roof. The one with the gables is what's Mount Pleasant or Munsbury, which is not well-known ruins, but it's looking down to Maho Bay, where coconut palms are, very tall coconut palms are lining the shore behind there. The hills above Maho were some of the ones that really broke my heart the most, because particularly the hill that is facing you when you leave the Maho overlook heading into Maho has absolutely beautiful vegetation. It's, as we could see in Carstensen's painting, it's looked pretty much the same for 115 years, but it is coming back really nicely now. I thought it wasn't going to come back, but the coconuts in Maho itself are another story. I've been looking for clues to what happened historically, and it never, keep having aha moments about vegetation. This is what was the trail from Annaberg to Leinster Bay. And it's where the two boats are sitting now, right there. I never really stopped to think about it. That was actually a drivable, very drivable road until Hurricane Marilyn. And well, you go, but Marilyn, actually, you could still drive to the beach after Marilyn. You could drive to Leinster Beach. It actually was briefly drivable all the way to Coral Bay in the 1970s. I never really stopped to think about the vegetation there. The trees that are in that picture and on the side in here, this is actually behind the beach at Leinster Bay, are not native. They are what everybody is now calling maho, and I may be partly responsible for guilty of that myself, but it's the tree that I grew up calling Otahiti, which reflects where it actually came from. And it is one of the few cases with an introduced tree where I actually have documentation of when and who brought it to the Virgin Islands, and it was in the 1700s. But it's a seashore tree, and obviously it was planted to protect that road. All of them are even aged, and a lot of them are gone now, particularly the seaside group of them. But it does really well in that situation. It is not, to me, an issue on coasts like this, but it is, unfortunately, it invades